Okay, good Friday morning, Backyard Naturalist. My name is Tim. I work at the Urban Ecology Center here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm absolutely delighted to be spending some time with you this morning as we approach peak spring splendor. The warblers fluttering in, uh, and just so many more uh, reports of birds coming in all the time, and insects, and you name it. The phenology, the floodgates are opened, and I'm excited to be here with you. Thank you for spending your time with me in this fantastic community. One of the featured animals in a past Backyard Naturalist episode was the white-tailed deer. And the resident deer here in Milwaukee are in a tense battle with the Celtic people of Boston in what has been a really fun and competitive playoffs. Go Bucks. Win or lose, it's been really fun following that journey. Both really fun teams. And this is relevant. Today, we're focusing on a group of birds that, to the best of my knowledge, is not a professional sports team mascot, like the Blue Jays of Toronto or the Orioles of Baltimore or the Cardinals of St. Louis. But after hearing some of these stories today, you may join me in wondering why the heck there isn't a Chicago Hummingbirds sports team or a Cleveland Ruby Throats, because hummingbirds are maybe the toughest vertebrates on the planet, as we will see today, as the threes align in episode 33 of season 3 of The Backyard Naturalist, Humming to America. First, a quick and heartfelt thank you to all of the Backyard Naturalist subscribers out there. Your support means a lot to me. It makes it possible for us to all gather weekly here, rain or shine, no matter the weather, here on Friday mornings. And I'd like to thank UEC members for supporting the mission, our mission of connecting people in cities to nature and to each other. And a quick reminder that summer equipment lending is just around the corner. So this is a time when members can borrow watercraft, canoes, kayaks, camping gear, bikes. Beginning May 26th is when the lending starts, but reservations open in 2 days on May 15th. And for more information, you can visit our website or contact membership manager Glenna Holstein. And tomorrow, it all starts tomorrow, the annual Brew City Birding Festival, which is becoming more and more in person and a little less virtual, but still taking advantage of the benefits of both. And after 2 years of hiatus, the Green Birding Challenge returns tomorrow to kick off this week-long celebration of birds. Sign up individually for programs, or you can save a little bit and support the UEC's research team by considering the purchase of a frequent flyer pass. It's a busy and fun week, and then we can all sleep when it's over. So today we are focusing on a group of birds that seemingly never sleep, the hummingbirds. And one of the interesting things about hummingbirds, one of the many interesting things you're going to hear about today, is that if you live east of the Mississippi River, there is no need for a hummingbird identification guide, because whether you're in Toronto or Milwaukee or Boston or Atlanta, if you see a hummingbird, you can be almost positive that you're looking at a ruby-throated hummingbird, with the exception of a few rare accidental migrants. So all of our hummingbirds here, for the most part, are the ruby-throated variety. And so our hummingbird takes up a fraction of a page in our bird books, which might be surprising to someone who's, let's say, may have moved here recently from Los Angeles, where if you're there in California, you've got about 8 species of hummingbirds to choose from. So that's a couple of pages in a field guide. Of course, if you're in Costa Rica, you need several pages. They have more than 50 hummingbirds. And if you go a little bit farther south to Ecuador, you got about 135 species. Ecuador and Colombia, 130 plus species of hummingbirds. And, incidentally, both Costa Rica and Ecuador are upcoming UEC Eco Travel trips. So we'd love for you to join us. So about a third of all of the world's 338, I think the number might even be above 340 now, but about a third of all the world's species can be found in Ecuador and or Colombia too. All hummingbirds are in fact found in the quote unquote New World. the Americas. There are none in Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia. They're all here, and they all belong to the family Trochilidae, which diverged from the swifts about 22 million years ago. So all 340 plus species are in the Americas. They can be found as far south as Patagonia and as far north as southern Alaska and parts of Canada. They're found in an amazing diversity of habitats. Today, we will look at the kind of the basic hummingbird body plan and all of their fantastic adaptations. But the characteristic that hummingbirds are known for more than anything probably is their size. In fact, even the name of the family Trochilidae, it means tiny, tiny bird. And if you think of a hummingbird, probably the first thing that comes to your mind is also, or one of the first things is also tiny. So when you look at, let's say there are 338 species, not a single one of them weighs more than an ounce. An ounce is a 16th of a pound. So let's start at the big end of the spectrum. This is the largest hummingbird there is, the oxymoronically named giant hummingbird. This bird weighs in at a whopping 20 grams, and the largest individual ever recorded, the largest hummingbird, weighed in at 24 grams. May sound big. That's still decently less than an ounce. The largest hummingbird ever, at least the largest living hummingbird, weighs about the same as a single AA battery. So it's really light, but the size, the length of this hummingbird is pretty impressive for a hummingbird. It's about 9 inches from tail to beak, and it's got a wingspan also about 9 inches. So the giant hummingbird is about the same size as a starling or a cardinal. And, objectively, I think that probably seems big for a hummingbird. And so, this might be skewing a little bit your thought of how big hummingbirds are. They can't be that small if they're the size of a starling. But then when you realize that if you go from the largest hummingbird, the next largest hummingbird is about half the size of this hummingbird. So 337 of the 338 species of hummingbirds are really tiny. It just so happens there's this big outlier out there in the giant hummingbird. On the flip side, the smallest hummingbird and the smallest bird in the entire world is the incredibly adorable bee hummingbird, which I and others, a few of you who traveled to Cuba with us, we were able to see this. Another UEC Eco Travel shameless plug. But the male bee hummingbird weighs less than 2 grams, less than 7/100ths of an ounce, and their body length, including the bill, from the tip of the tail to the tip of the bill is just breaks 2 inches. So to put it into perspective, if you've got a dime laying around, if you still use coins, if you've got a dime laying around, pick that dime up, feel how much that weighs. The male bee hummingbird weighs less than that dime. In fact, if you mailed 14 bee hummingbirds in an envelope, you would only need 1 postage stamp, according to the folks at Stuff You Should Know. So really, really tiny. And some of you remember this. One time after a bird walk, someone said, "Hey, Tim, we saw just a ton of red-winged blackbirds out there in Washington Park," which then led me to think of, you saw a ton of hummingbirds. You're telling me you saw 2,000 pounds of red-winged blackbirds, which then led my brain to work with my dad and a few others to calculate how many red-winged blackbirds it would actually take to make a ton. And then a few of us started to calculate the birds per ton index, famous in our small circle here. And so in other words, how many birds would it take to actually equal a ton? So for red-winged blackbirds, the answer is 11,035. So if you tell me you saw a ton of red-winged blackbirds, technically you'd have to see over 11,000 of them if you wanted your statement to be accurate. If we looked at the heaviest bird in the world, the ostrich, it only takes about 6 ostriches to make a ton. But to get a ton of bee hummingbirds, you just need 463,769 of them. So almost 500,000, which is way more bee hummingbirds than there are in the world. since they're only found in parts of Cuba and nowhere else. So after size, probably the second most prominent characteristic of hummingbirds is flight. They're the only vertebrates in the entire world that can hover in place for an extended period of time without the aid of wind. So you may see a chickadee just seem to stop in midair for a second. You may have seen kestrels kind of hovering over a field hunting for food, but neither of those birds can hover without the aid of wind or for an extended period of time. Hummingbirds can not only hover for a long time, they can fly backwards, which no other vertebrate animal can do. They can also fly side to side and even upside down. So true masters of the air, outperformed only by insects, which have been perfecting the art of flying for a lot longer, much longer period of time than birds, hundreds of millions of years longer. So insects are the true masters of flight, but in the bird world, there's not much that can rival the hummingbird. And one of the main reasons that hummingbirds can hover and fly backwards in every which way is that they generate lift on both the up and down strokes. And I don't even know if you could call either of those up or down. When you look at the hummingbird picture on the left, it's more like a figure 8. But lift is generated on both the up and down strokes, and that's no other bird does that. All other birds are generating lift on the downstroke. The upstroke is kind of a recovery. So this allows for those precision flight maneuvers. Hummingbirds are also called hummingbirds because they flap their wings so fast that it produces a humming sound. So if you're ever spent time near a hummingbird feeder and you have them flying around your head, I know one time I was wearing a red bandana and I kept having a hummingbird visit thinking it was a flower. It sounds like a bunch of tiny buzzing drones everywhere. They kind of sound like insects. And it's because they're flapping their wings really, really fast. So how fast? If you take an average kind of nonchalant hummingbird flight, you're talking 70 wing beats per second. 70 wing beats per second, which is faster than the human eye can see. At best, we could make out 50 wing beats per minute, which is why when you see a hummingbird, it looks like a body with 2 blurs on either side. But even 70 wing beats per second pales in comparison to the 200 wing beats per second that a hummingbird can produce in a courtship dive. So that is just the most insane thing. 200 times in a second. So in the time it takes me to say 1 Mississippi, a hummingbird can beat its wings 200 times. I'm not sure if I can do anything 200 times in a minute, let alone a second, which brings us to one of the major take-home messages of today, is that hummingbirds are one of the most efficient animals on the planet. For a bird that is so tiny to expend so much energy, pretty much everything they do is at max speed. The dial is up to 11. They're the poster child for efficient metabolism. They burn fuel at almost 100% efficiency. And I think humans are in the 30 to 40%. And so, when they fly and even just the regular non-hurried sort of average flight, they're still moving 30 miles an hour. If they need to get somewhere in a hurry, they can go 45, bring it up a notch. And in a dive, they can go 55. So this intense metabolism means that at rest, that little hummingbird heart is pumping blood at about 225 beats per minute at rest. During flight, that kicks up a bunch of gears, and they're talking 1,200 beats per minute. And so it's that kind of metabolism necessarily. It means that hummingbirds got to eat. They are efficient and amazing, but at the metabolic rates they are maintaining and experiencing, hummingbirds are always kind of living on the edge. They're always kind of on the edge of survival. Food is everything to a hummingbird. When they're awake, they pretty much have to eat constantly. If they go for more than a few hours without food, that could be fatal to a hummingbird. So they have to eat constantly to produce their energy needs. And in an average day, they will eat 2 to 3 times their body weight in food every day. And so for perspective, the human equivalent of eating 2 to 3 times our body weight, if you have a 170-pound human, that would mean eating a little over 500 pounds of food per day. So to put that into perspective, so Jenny can understand here, that's 816 boxes of Fruit Loops in a day. Or for others, that's 1,100 McDonald's cheeseburgers in a day. And this is like the average day. This isn't the like I'm about to migrate or run a marathon day. This is an average day. And some hummingbirds do migrate. And we're going to talk about migration quite a bit next week. But if you consider the ruby-throated hummingbird, our hummingbird, before they migrate, they have to put on about half of their body weight, about 40% of their mass. So again, that'd be like 170-pound human moving up to 250 plus pounds in just a couple of weeks. A typical migrating hummingbird travels at about 23 miles per day. So, that's a lot when you consider how small hummingbirds are, but 23 miles a day doesn't seem terrible. But our ruby-throated hummingbird has to cross the Gulf of Mexico. And if you're crossing the Gulf of Mexico, you can't just fly 20 miles and take a rest. You have to do 500 miles in a single pop. And so they fly 500 miles in less than a day. It takes them about 18 hours without stopping. That tiny little bird just ups and flies 500 miles. And I mean, if you think about efficiency and gas mileage and miles per gallon, just imagine doing what they do. They're just putting like a few drops of gas, essentially. They're only adding a tiny bit of weight. And then, so adding a few drops of gas to your car and then driving for 500 miles. But that's not even a good comparison. It'd be like putting a few drops of fuel into your airplane and then, flying from Milwaukee to Nashville. So, and they can fly farther than that. It's estimated that a single fully fattened up hummingbird with no headwind could fly probably 1,400 miles without stopping. So that's a hummingbird lifting off from Milwaukee and landing in Phoenix, Arizona. So it's impossible to overestimate just how efficient hummingbirds are in their metabolism, and they're maintaining 105-degree body temperature on top of this. So they live fast and furious, and because of that extra stress, migrating hummingbirds tend to live a little bit of a shorter lifespan, maybe 4, 5, 6 years, compared to non-migratory hummingbirds, which can live a decade or more.
Hey, Tim.
Yeah.
We had a question back about the giant and bee hummingbirds.
Sure.
Where are those found?
The bee hummingbird is found only in parts of Cuba. And I'm not sure where the giant hummingbird is, but we can, I'm sure some of you can look it up quickly and throw it in the chat. Somewhere in South America, I'm sure. Good question. So maybe somebody wants to go find it. That'd be pretty cool to be able to see both the largest and smallest hummingbird. If you have a hummingbird feeder in your backyard and you pay attention, and I actually have, there's quite a few, I guess I know a lot of people that like to pay attention to birds and phenology. And one thing that I've heard quite a bit is that people who pay attention, who journal this, will tell me that their hummingbird returns to their feeder on the exact same day almost every year. And if you consider that once food, the key today is food is everything, the hummingbird. So if a hummingbird finds a good patch of food and it turns out to be your yard, and it's not just your feeder, right? Your feeder is going to be part of the whole territory. Your feeder is very kind of supplemental to this. But if their territory includes your feeder and that got them through the year, they're going to return to that spot. And they're just so precise in their timing. They're so precise in their navigational sense. I mean, for a bird with a brain the size of a rice grain, they're amazing at getting back to the same spot, called philopatry, like the love of your homeland. They're coming back to the same spot in the same your same yard, and often on the very same day, which just kind of blows my mind. You know, it's like trains in Switzerland. They're gonna show up when they're supposed to. And if you heard me say earlier that a hummingbird can't go more than a few hours without eating, then you might be asking, well, you know, how do they, does that mean they can't sleep through the night, right? Do they constantly have to wake up for a snack? And thankfully for the hummingbird, the answer is no, because at night when they do sleep, they do finally kind of take that metabolism dial down to a more sane level. So when they're sleeping, pretty much every night they go into a torpor, a kind of like a mini hibernation, and they'll lower their body temperature by 30 or even 40 degrees. They'll lower their heart beats to a much more human-like pace of about 50 beats per minute. And this allows them to conserve energy and then, you know, sleep through the night and rest up. And it's a very deep sleep. So, you know, you could come up to a sleeping hummingbird and I'm not, you know, don't do this, but you could probably pick it up and or move it and it wouldn't wake up. It's this very deep sleep. So it allows them to conserve energy. And sometimes the sleep is so deep that they don't realize they're hanging upside down or, you know, off to the side, just like we all do. And their friends try to take pictures of them in awkward sleeping poses so they can make fun of them the next day. In some of the more extreme environments like the Andes, they might go into torpor for longer periods of time, especially during the harsher seasons. And it's really interesting that the Andes are one of the hotbeds of hummingbird evolution. And we'll talk about pollinating in a little bit, but sometimes they live in areas that are too cold for insects. And the air is very thin up in the mountains. So it's where you get some of the bigger birds because they have to have a big enough wing to fly in that thin air. But in those harsher environments, they'll go into torpor for a little bit longer. So it is possible for a hummingbird to chill a bit and kind of take a break from their frenetic lifestyle. But back to eating. So you know, again, they're pretty much eating all the time to survive. And we think of them as nectar eaters or nectarivores. And for the most part, they are nectar eating specialists. And this is pretty obvious when you see a flower that has nectar hidden in the base of a long tube, and then a hummingbird comes up with a bill that's the exact shape and size of that tube. So pretty much it fits the bill. And if the flower is pointing downward, then it's only accessible by hummingbirds because they're the only birds that can hover. So flowers and hummingbirds will often co-evolve together, and you'll see the hummingbird bill shape match the flower shape, and the flower is saying, here, I've reserved this carbohydrate-rich food source just for you. No other animal can get this. Your beak shape is the key to the axis. So have at it. And while you're drinking my nectar, please take a little bit of my pollen with you and drop it off on another flower. That's all I'm asking. And so hummingbirds are a major pollinator, on average, pollinating between 1,000 and 2,000 flowers in a single day, which you know by itself is amazing. And you start to get a little desensitized to how amazing all this stuff is. But it's still worth celebrating how important hummingbirds are as pollinators. And again, if it's an environment that insects can't live in, they're the only pollinators. So super important. And then one of the coolest adaptations to specializing on nectar is the wonder of the hummingbird tongue. And at a glance, I mean, when I see a hummingbird sipping nectar at a flower feeder, I don't normally think about what's going on there. To me, it doesn't seem much more than like, you know, putting a straw into a milkshake and sucking it up. But it's so much more than that. When you look at it, what's actually happening at the tongue level is mind blowing. So first of all, they have very long tongues. So they're not just inserting that beak into the flower, they're inserting the beak and then that long tongue. And that tongue is moving back and forth very quickly, as you'd expect in that frenetic hummingbird lifestyle. That tongue is going back and forth about 13 times per second to bring in the nectar. That fast and furious. And then to add to that tongue splits at the end to form two structures, which essentially doubles the amount of nectar they're taking up with each lap. And for a long time, we thought that split tongue was using capillary action to bring the nectar into the mouth. But there are recent studies that show it's much more complicated and much stranger even. And we'll take our first video break here to look at a simulation of this amazing adaptation.
The hummingbird's tongue is about twice as long as its beak, so it can reach deep into a flower. And until recently, many scientists believed that the birds relied heavily on capillary action
There's the
to draw the
pollen
nectar
at the
through
bill.
their tongues and into their mouths. Kind of like water spontaneously rising up a thin straw in a glass. But some fascinating discoveries at the University of Connecticut have shown that the mechanisms involved are much more dynamic than anyone realized.
The hummingbird's tongue is actually a nectar trap equipped with a pair of narrow tubes that taper sharply. The tip of each tube is segmented into a row of flaps that are attached to a supporting rod. When the bird isn't eating, these flaps form two rows of closed loops that fit compactly into the beak. But when the hummingbird feeds, its tongue undergoes a dramatic transformation. Inside the flower, the tongue extends to make contact with the nectar. When immersed in fluid, the tip splits and the flaps on each fork systematically unfurl. Then, as the tongue is withdrawn, the flaps close tightly to seal and capture the nectar for delivery into the bird's mouth. This entire process is executed automatically in less than a 20th of a second, thousands of times a day.
From flower to flower to flower to flower, this brilliant iridescent body, there's a kind of jewel-like quality that they have. This exquisite workmanship, the colors and the sound that they make. I think in some respects, the wonder of a hummingbird almost transcends language. And we respond to what we see at a level really, you could say, deeper than rationality. I mean, it's not irrational, but it's almost like responding to the work of an artist. And at that level, we respond with our soul, with our emotions. What can you say? Words can't do it justice, so you just stand there and applaud.
So that just, I mean, just blows my mind that that they're doing that, all that is happening. And again, this is 13 times per second that all of that is happening, that the tongue is splitting and opening and then kind of trapping the nectar. And just insane to think about that all happening. And when you're at a feeder, you can see the little tongue sort of kind of going in and out really quickly. But pretty incredible. So while it's fair to say that hummingbirds are nectar eating specialists, there's only so much nutrition you can get from sugar alone. And like any good nutritionist, hummingbirds do supplement their nectar diet quite a bit with protein, usually in the form of insects and spiders. In fact, hummingbirds get quite a lot of protein from animals, from insects. So if you think about it, because a hummingbird is eating another animal, they technically could be called birds of prey, predators. And if hummingbirds weren't already awesome enough, maybe you can guess what one of their favorite food items is: mosquitoes. So mosquitoes make a perfect meal for tiny hummingbird, and they help reduce the population in our backyard. So not only they're pollinator plants, they're also an effective form of pest control. They'll eat mosquitoes and gnats and wasps and spiders and other insects. But when you're such a small predator, sometimes unfortunately the tables can turn, and the insect or the spider eats you back. So it's a dangerous life being such a tiny bird of prey, when you have to worry a little bit about that the food you're trying to eat might eat you back. So again, hummingbirds are kind of in this really tight feedback loop. They have that extremely high metabolism, which requires a lot of food. And then to acquire a lot of food, you need that high metabolism. It's kind of that cycle. And a hummingbird's daily checklist is pretty simple. You need to eat almost the entire day, and that's pretty much it. So occasionally you will see a hummingbird take a break, take a rest on their favorite perch, do a little grooming. They have to rest to mate. They don't mate on the wing, but most of the day involves feeding. And that has resulted in a hummingbird characteristic that may surprise you a little bit. They are one of the least social birds on the planet. There's no, hummingbird holding hands. They're apart from a mother raising her young and the very quick mating process, hummingbirds almost never socialize. In fact, they are maybe the most territorial bird in the world, mainly because food is their life. It's the most important part of their life. They have to eat or die. And that doesn't mean, I know other animals have kind of figured out a way to that are just relying on food to share, but I think they're so on the edge that this hasn't really evolved. So sharing food is pretty much unheard of. If you're a hummingbird and you find a good, reliable patch of flowers, that could mean the difference between life and death. So it makes sense that you would want to defend that territory, not only from other hummingbirds, but from other nectar-loving insects like bees and butterflies. Hummingbirds don't care. They will chase away anything that flies into its airspace, even on occasions a large bird like a hawk. So you see this when you're at a hummingbird feeder often. Unless you have the one resident hummingbird at your feeder, you will see hummingbirds chasing each other away, particularly if you go to the tropics where you have multiple species at a feeder. You'll see the dynamics, and it's not always the biggest birds that are ruling the roost. Sometimes the littlest birds are chasing away the biggest birds. So they want to eat, but they're very, very territorial, and they just chase away anything, and they're just not very social. So then talking about another hummingbird characteristic is color. So, and maybe, the most striking characteristic of hummingbird is not just the brilliance of their colors, but their seeming ability to be able to turn the colors on and off as if they had this little tiny switch. So if you've had the good fortune to be able to watch a hummingbird or several hummingbirds at a feeder, you could see an individual, maybe it looks like this, and then with a blink of an eye, that same bird, you'll see this. And the hummingbird, it doesn't have a switch to turn these colors on, but all it takes for them is just the slightest body movement, because the brilliant colors in hummingbirds are structural. They don't come from a pigment. So the difference between you seeing a drab or a brilliant bird is the result of the physical structures in their feathers that can separate and focus colors and magnify them. We talk about this more in Starling Wars about how iridescence works. But essentially the color that you see is the result of light bouncing off that gorget, that part of the hummingbird, the throat and the upper breast feathers is called the gorgets, and that's where most of the color is concentrated. And then the angle of your eye is super important. So you and I could be standing right next to each other, and you see brilliance and I see dull. But then the hummingbird makes the slightest movement, and then I see brilliance and you see the muted colors. And so hummingbirds use this in courtship, and the brilliance of color is often a good indicator of the bird's fitness, which is an indicator of good genetic makeup, which is something that a female hummingbird wants to pass on to their offspring. And sometimes hummingbirds will flash their brilliance by hovering, and other times they incorporate color or sound into a courtship dance. And just like with many birds, different species of hummingbirds have different courtship dances. And our familiar ruby-throated hummingbird goes into this. I've seen it a couple times. It goes into this tight flight formation for its courtship dance. It's like a pendulum. So it's like the ruby-throated hummingbird pendulum back and forth and up and down in this little tight formation. And the male is displaying both its flying ability and its color. And then sometimes the hummingbirds will incorporate sound through a series of chirps from their throat, but sometimes the chirp doesn't come from their voice, it comes from the wings. And we'll see that in this next video break.
First, he woos her with a song. Now he's got her attention. The stage is set for the greatest example of speed dating in the world. Next, he climbs 30 meters above her. Then for the grand finale, he hurtles straight at the ground. And that was it. Over in a few hundredths of a second. And again. To see what he's doing, you need to slow things down. This is much more than just high-speed flying. By folding his wings in tightly, he mimics a missile, traveling nearly 400 times his length every second. At the last moment, he pulls up sharply, pulling more G's than a fighter pilot. It's not just the speed, the height, or the angle of his flight. It's all about serenading on the wing. His tail is singing a sweet song with jet fighter force. The air screaming through his spread out tail feathers makes them vibrate in a very special way. Slowed down, this is the sound it makes. It's far louder than any of his singing, and the faster he dives, the better it sounds. Who'd have thought that a sound like this, or this, would make all the difference and see off the competition? To her, it proves he's fit. This speed demon has won himself a mate by pushing himself to the limit and proving he's got what it takes. But he's not the only one who knows that a little showing off can go a long way.
So
First, he woos.
if courtship is successful, that results in mating, which usually takes place on a branch and lasts about 4 seconds. And then after that, the pair separates, never to see each other again unless they happen to mate again in future years. So the female goes off to build the nest. She will perform 100% of the childcare, which seems pretty sucky from a human perspective. But from an evolutionary perspective, the strategy makes sense when you remember just how important good territories are to the livelihood of a hummingbird. So if a parent, whether it be it male or female, if they had to share the food in their territory with both their offspring and their mate, it's likely that somebody wouldn't survive. So it's probably beneficial to both parties that after they mate, they separate and go back to securing their food in their territories to maintain their high metabolic lifestyles. So Female builds a nest, and like everything else hummingbird, they're tiny, about the size of a ping pong ball, but beautifully constructed, often interwoven with spider silk, which is extremely strong, and decorated with lichen, which helps to camouflage. And then they lay 1 or 2 hummingbird eggs, which are literally the size of a pea each. And if both siblings survive, you witness the ultimate game of Tetris as these tiny growing bodies have to fit into that tiny ping pong ball nest until they can fly on their own. And normally I bring the evolution of the species, talk about that at the beginning of the episode, but the narrative of hummingbird evolution, in my opinion, seems to be a good way to kind of wrap things up this week, because it's just interesting to note where we are in the history of this group of species. So some groups like ducks and shorebirds and hawks are, we think, in a relatively stable evolutionary pattern, meaning that the rate at which new species evolve is about the same as the rate at which species are going extinct. Now, we can't study that within our lifetime because this takes millions of years. But hummingbirds, we think, are in the midst of an explosion of new species. So the rate at which new species of hummingbirds are evolving is far outpacing the rate at which species are going extinct. So it's this adaptive radiation. It could be explained by the belief that the earliest hummingbird species, actually the oldest hummingbird fossils, were found in Germany. So they evolved in Europe and Asia. And it could be that niche competition just didn't result in hummingbirds being successful there. But then when they colonized the Americas, they may have been the only animal in town that fit these niches. And this became the epicenter of hummingbird evolution. Actually, the Andes Mountains, because of all the pockets of habitats where populations become separated from other populations, experience different evolutionary pressures and then mutations. They evolve different physical and behavioral adaptations, which results in speciation. So the ancestral hummingbirds evolved from the swift line of birds. And when you look at the two side by side, you can see some similarities. They're both way more comfortable on the wing, and neither of these birds can walk or hop. Have you ever seen a hummingbird or a swift walk or hop? Me neither. So hummingbirds and swifts have very weak feet that serve pretty much one purpose. It allows them to perch on a branch to sleep or rest. And in the case of a chimney swift, it's that hollow tree or the chimney at night. In fact, the order of swifts is called Apodidae, which means no feet. So as long as conditions are maintained, we expect hummingbirds to continue to grow and prosper, maybe double the number of species in few tens of millions of years. Hopefully they continue to grow and prosper. We as humans have the ultimate power, at least in the short term, to make sure that these needs are met in terms of healthy habitat and food sources. So they're one of the many protected species of the Migratory Bird Act of 1918. So it's illegal to mess with them. So don't. One of the best ways you can not mess with hummingbirds is to keep your cats inside, because while there are no natural predators that specialize in eating hummingbirds, occasionally you get the opportunistic hawk or the spider that we saw earlier. House cats are one of the biggest dangers to wild hummingbird populations. And the other biggest potential hazard is habitat loss, which would result in population loss. And there are few things you can do on a few fronts. So you can plant native species in your yards. You've heard this over and over again. I know Larry and Gailey are working on a nice pollinator garden at their synagogue. And so if you have land, your backyard or other lands that you might own or steward, healthy native plant communities provide shelter. They provide substrates for nests and food in the form of nectar and insects. Native nectar producing flowers like bee balm and cardinal flower, coral honeysuckle, trumpet creeper, they add color to your yard, and they support native wildlife, including hummingbirds. And your hummingbird feeder, as long as you maintain it well and have the right food in, don't add dyes. Like with a lot of other feeders, it probably doesn't hurt the hummingbirds. It probably doesn't help them, but it does provide enjoyment for you. So my favorite hummingbird plant is the columbine, not only because I do see hummingbirds visiting them, but they're also edible to humans. So you can just pop that columbine flower, take a taste of it, the whole thing, eat it. It's got this beautiful, subtle sweetness that's from the nectar, the same nectar that the hummingbirds are trying to get, and humans can taste it. In fact, hummingbirds are one of the only birds that have taste buds that can distinguish sweet, and they prefer sweet, and they seek after sweet. And a lot of birds are driven by that savory, the protein, the meat, but hummingbirds are driven by sweet. And so if you pop a columbine flower in your mouth, you do get a little bit of that sweet nectar, and it just tastes really good. It's subtle, but just make sure you leave enough flowers for the birds. And then another thing you can do to support hummingbirds, if you're a coffee drinker, which I'm going to assume you are, or if you're Zeke and Betsy, a future coffee drinker, look for coffee that is designated bird friendly, shade grown, and or Rainforest Alliance organic. So we'll wrap up the day with this fantastic Zen video. There were so many, and I encourage you to look up hummingbird courtship, but this was one of my favorites, and it's a good way to end the program.
Well concealed in the undergrowth, a tiny bird is full of hope. The male wire-crested thorntail requests the pleasure of this dance. The 4-inch tall hummingbird presents himself. And then pulls out all the stops. His solo lasts just a few seconds. It takes slow motion to truly enjoy this vigorous performance. Using every seduction trick in the book, he tries to persuade her that he is Mr. Right. The display costs the male an enormous amount of energy, but it's his only chance to win a mate. The female finally responds, follows him, but just so far. She simply is not that into him. Well,
So that's it for hummingbirds. Thanks so much for joining us today, and I hope you're enjoying the spring weather and the birds, and we will see you next week. And I will stop sharing
Excellent.
my screen.